The Genpei War, one of the earliest and most legendary samurai conflicts which led to the establishment of warrior rule over Japan. It was in this violent yet highly romanticized clash that the Taira and Minamoto families would be immortalized for their struggle for power, and in the aftermath would lead to the birth of the Kamakura shogunate. Yet the war also gave rise to a plethora of fascinating figures, names who are often remembered today as great leaders and visionaries, highly influential individuals who left their mark on history. It is these figures who we will be examining today, evaluating their skills, motives, foresight, and more, ranking each based on an established scale to determine how they all fared in the grand scheme of things. However, this will be done in two parts, as I am happy to be joined by Buyuuden Japanese History, a great channel that has set about telling the history of Japan using actual Japanese school textbooks, so that you can not only learn about Japanese history, but also learn it in the same way students in Japan do so as well. Now, for this awesome two-part series, both he and I will be discussing 6 of the most important leading figures of the Genpei War. First in this video on my channel here, where we will examine Taira no Kiyomori, Taira no Munemori, and Emperor Go-Shirakawa, and then followed up by a second part on his channel, where we will examine Minamoto no Yoshinaka, Minamoto no Yoshitsune, and of course, Minamoto no Yoritomo. It is through diving deep into all of these figures that I hope we can all come to a better understanding of them and how they all fared during the fascinating and prominent years of the Genpei War. Now, in terms of how we will actually be going about doing this, it will largely be done by examining 6 key areas for each figure, in a method you might have seen in video games, as these values will come together to form a hexagonal rating of sorts. These 6 categories will be ambition, political ability, leadership, popularity, foresight, and overall luck. So, with that said, Buyuuden is going to kick it off with the man who started it all, Taira no Kiyomori.
The Ise Taira had been on a nice upward trajectory since the time of Kiyomori's grandfather, and Kiyomori definitely had a great base to build off when he took over leadership of the clan. He certainly didn't build his power from nothing. That being said, I don't think anyone would have imagined that he'd take what was basically a powerful family of glorified bodyguards and make them the de facto rulers of Japan, supplanting the old guard aristocracy that had been running the country for centuries. He was the first samurai to ever be appointed to the position of Daijo Daijin, the most exalted political office within the imperial bureaucracy, and he had his sons and relatives appointed to numerous other prestigious offices, culminating in his grandson literally sitting on the imperial throne. Beyond his drive for political success, he was also an enterprising businessman, engaging so vigorously in private trade with Song China that the import of Chinese coinage is said to have reached its peak during his era, a development that would have a significant effect on Japan's economy for generations. Kiyomori's ambition was off the charts, and his rise to the top was no accident. It was exactly the result that he was hoping for. And for that reason, I believe his ambition rating warrants the maximum 5 out of 5.
It would have been difficult for Kiyomori to emerge from the position he did without gaining some shred of political savvy, being born into the Ise branch of the extremely prominent Taira family, only to later lead his family into a place nearly atop all of Japan after the Hogen and Heiji rebellions. As was already discussed, by this point he had amassed a great ambition, not only by placing the Taira atop the warrior class, but also the seat of the emperor himself, through means of having a Taira-born offspring ascend to the chrysanthemum throne. But still, even with all his power and ability, he faced all manner of opposition from others within the Japanese aristocracy. And this is where Kiyomori's greatest detriment came in, because as great as he was, at heart, he was still a warrior, and trying to push his agenda through would in the end lead to a conflict he never dreamed would occur. Which then leads to why I would give Kiyomori a 4 out of 5 in terms of his political ability, just coming shy of true greatness.
Kiyomori was consistently a unifying force within his clan for the duration of his time as its leader. With the exception of the Hogen disturbance, which occurred right after Kiyomori had first taken over leadership of the Taira as a relatively young man, we never see any infighting within the clan while he's in charge. In fact, his leadership was so effective that one could even say his clan came to rely on him too much, to the point that when he died in 1181, his surviving family members seem to have been at a total loss as to how to move forward. The fact that people still like to speculate even today how the Genpei War might have played out if Kiyomori hadn't died is proof of just how significant of an effect his presence or absence had on the world around him. Moreover, Kiyomori was also responsible for spearheading Japan's only capital change between the years of 794 and 1868, that being the short-lived move to the city of Fukuhara in modern-day Kobe in 1180. Heiankyo, aka Kyoto, was ultimately reinstated as the capital thanks to the outbreak of the Genpei War and the need for Kiyomori to focus his energy on dealing with the Minamoto uprising. But his ability to plan this ostentatious project and get the imperial court and aristocracy to come along for the ride is a prime example of what a commanding force he was in society and government. Taira no Kiyomori was one of the most dominant leaders in Japanese history, and I believe his leadership score should reflect that, with another perfect 5 out of 5.
It should be no surprise that Kiyomori garnered a wide range of enemies throughout his life. Plenty at the time would have easily considered him to have been the most controversial figure Japan had ever known up until that point. Obviously seen as a paragon within the actual Taira family, his efforts to strengthen the Taira's position over the imperial capital and over all of Japan itself would see him earn fierce rivalries against not only political opponents within the nobility, but more famously, the entire Minamoto family, who would emerge from the exile Kiyomori had imposed upon them after the end of the Heiji Rebellion and had come to challenge him in the Genpei War. Had he been perhaps less ambitious and more of a figure who represented stability in the wake of the Hogen and Heiji Rebellion, he may have been viewed more favorably. Because, as it stands, by the outbreak of the Genpei War in 1180, Taira support was arguably at an all-time low. I give his popularity ranking a 2 out of 5.
Kiyomori's powers of foresight were a bit of a mixed bag. He displayed shrewd powers of judgment in the Hogen and Heiji disturbances in his early career, coming out victorious in both conflicts as other powerful Bushi warriors dropped like flies around him. He was far-sighted economically as well, with the aforementioned effort he put into expanding trade with Song China, a policy which not only made his family phenomenally wealthy, but also had long-lasting cultural impact on Japan as a whole. His legendary excavation of the Ondo no Seto Strait by Hiroshima is one example of a trade-related project whose influence continues to be felt even today, although the truth of this legend is disputed. Kiyomori did, however, exhibit some notable lapses in judgment that, in hindsight at least, can certainly be pointed out as major factors for his clan's eventual downfall. The first of these is of course his choice to spare the life of Minamoto no Yoritomo after the Heiji disturbance in 1160, a decision which certainly haunted him in his final years. His coup d'etat of 1179, in which he forcibly seized control of Kyoto's government, can also be viewed as a seriously short-sighted misstep, as while it did bring his clan short-term power, it was also a major step toward establishing their reputation as heavy-handed tyrants and turning aristocratic society against them. Kiyomori may have been a great leader and an able politician, but his tendency to make emotional choices in the moment rather than keeping his eye on the long term is why I feel his foresight score only deserves to be a 3 out of 5.
Unfortunately, despite all his other triumphs, luck was never on Kiyomori's side in the long run. Not only did his plans face stiff resistance from many within the capital, and later the resurfaced Minamoto family who would challenge him through the Genpei War, but more significantly, he would come to die 1 year after the war began. So, not only did he lead his family into a massive conflict where the fate of Japan hung in the balance, but he also would never live long enough to see his plans through, leaving his clan without his great leadership and wisdom moving forward. Not to mention leaving them without his drive and ambition. So although he did have a lot that did go his way throughout his rise to power, in the end, it did not come to ultimately matter as things fell apart. Still, I'll give him a middle ground ranking of 3 out of 5 in terms of luck. Not bad, but definitely not good. With that all covered, This is how we would rank Taira no Kiyomori as a prominent figure of the Genpei War. But moving on, let's now look to cover his son and heir, Taira no Munemori.
It is hard to give Munemori a high score in ambition, considering that he grew up as Kiyomori's son during the golden age of the Taira. Munemori's path to the top was laid out for him by his father, mother, and older family members, and all he really had to do was to not majorly screw anything up. Likewise, he was designated future leader of the Taira by his father after his older brother Shigemori died, so his eventual rise to leadership of the clan was nothing more than him following the status quo. The only real example of Munemori displaying any strong ambition was his refusal to bend in the face of the Taira's enemies during the Genpei War. At one point during the war, Minamoto no Yoritomo sent correspondence to retired Emperor Go-Shirakawa, suggesting that he wanted to cooperate with Munemori to restore peace to the country, but Munemori flatly rejected this idea upon hearing of it. After the Battle of Ichinotani, Munemori's younger brother Shigehira was captured, and Go-Shirakawa and the Minamoto offered to trade Shigehira back to the Taira in exchange for the return of the imperial treasures. Again, Munemori refused, even allegedly threatening to take the treasures and run away to continental Asia if push came to shove. Munemori may not have had the ambition of some kind of great conqueror, but he at least had the ambition to try not to lose what his father and grandfather had built. And for that reason, I've chosen to give him a poor but not awful ambition score of 2 out of 5.
Munemori was born into a tough spot for sure, but his upbringing definitely was one that gave promise to a budding politician. With a father like Kiyomori, Munemori was always destined for some role in the political sphere. Growing up in Kyoto, he was at the forefront of the Taira family's maneuvers to try and win over power and support. Through this, he would have had time to flex his skills with negotiation and diplomacy. Yet as much as we can say he showed promise, Munemori was never in a position to properly excel. When his father Kiyomori died in 1181, his faith was placed in Munemori's hands, being that his older brother had died several years earlier, making Munemori next in line. As a wartime leader, Munemori was at a disadvantage, not only being in a spot he likely had no desire to be in, but also not equipped for the hardships of being a wartime leader. To this end, he would attempt to smooth things over with the retired Emperor Go-Shirakawa, who he tried to rule alongside. And even later, after he was driven out of Kyoto, he would plead with Go-Shirakawa in hopes to make a grand resurgence. Yet that would never come to pass. Eventually, despite his best efforts, Munemori would face his end following the Taira defeat at the Battle of Dan-no-Ura, a place far out of his element. Yet it cannot be said that his political ability had not reared its head throughout his life, and in attempts to postpone the inevitable. For this, I give his political ability a 3 out of 5.
As a leader, Munemori did not inspire the same confidence in his followers that his father or his older brother had. Perhaps the most we can say for Munemori's leadership is that, for the most part, he kept the Taira together as a unit until the end of the war. He was never overthrown and he was never assassinated, so that's something, I suppose. However, he presided over a long string of great military defeats, and while he wasn't the actual field commander for any of those engagements, ultimate responsibility still has to fall at his feet. Moreover, he was unable to maintain the Taira's base of support in western Japan after their exodus from the capital, ultimately being driven out of Kyushu by one of his late older brother's former vassals. Following this incident, his relative and key vassal Taira no Sadayoshi abandoned him to enter the priesthood, and his nephew Taira no Kiyotsune took his own life, clearly illustrating just how poor morale was under his leadership. From here on, the Taira family was gradually pressed further and further onto the ropes, with their reputation eroding day by day. And while they did make a modest comeback in the months leading up to the Battle of Ichinotani, Munemori's leadership always seemed to have them a step or two behind their Minamoto foes. Munemori was not an absolute disaster of a leader, but he was a far cry from being a good one either, and because of that, I will be giving him a leadership score of just 2 out of 5.
Munemori was always in a sad spot, having to follow up the greatness that was Kiyomori and inheriting leadership of the clan well into a massive war for the fate of the country. He he had a very tough role to fit into if he was going to succeed, which, as we know, he did not. To this end, we can speculate all day about his shortcomings, not to mention, of course, his abysmal popular image. Not having the gusto of his father is one thing, but also being on the losing side of a major war is yet another. His father, Kiyomori, had already done enough to damage the reputation of the Taira, and now he, as the son, would have been handed all the criticism that had already been heaped upon his father's name. And with the turn in fate which saw the Taira beaten back and driven from Kyoto, things would have only gotten worse as his attempts to rebound fell flat. Finally, at the end, at the Battle of Dan-no-ura, when the rest of the Taira family were famously throwing themselves to their watery grave, Munemori was sadly unsuccessful, leading him to be captured and later executed in the capital. The culmination of his many failures have surely painted a picture of a very unpopular and ineffective man. Because of this, it only seems right that he should receive a poor 1 out of 5 in terms of his popularity.
When Munemori took over the Taira family, they were still politically and militarily the most powerful force in Japan, but by the end of his career they had been thoroughly annihilated, and this fact does not lead one to a very positive conclusion about his powers of foresight. One clear example of Munemori's short-sightedness was his first big military action after succeeding his father, his campaign against Minamoto no Yoshinaka in 1183. For this campaign, Munemori and the Taira assembled a massive army of what is said to have been close to 100,000 men, and they sent it deep into northwestern Japan to destroy Yoshinaka. However, they put together this army on the heels of a horrific famine and then planned to feed it by requisitioning food from local peasants as they marched. Why they needed such massive numbers to defeat a backcountry rebel is puzzling in itself, but what they got themselves was a bunch of angry peasants and a hungry, oversized army that eventually walked directly into a trap and suffered catastrophically heavy casualties. While this was perhaps the largest scale misjudgment for which Munemori can be blamed, the remainder of his career saw him constantly surprised and caught off guard by the way events around him were playing out. For spending the majority of the Genpei War in what seems to have been a state of bewildered shock, I believe Munemori deserves the lowest possible foresight score of 1 out of 5.
It is quite difficult to truly judge to what effect luck played for the figure of Munemori, as plenty of things leading up to the outbreak of the Genpei War were simply out of his hands. And even further, when he did assume leadership over the Taira family 1 year into the war, things would still sort of be out of his direct control. Of course, we can still say that his clan's defeat in the war was one piece of bad luck after another, but really, I feel there are too many moving parts in that argument to really put an estimation of poor luck entirely on him. Even in one of the rare instances when fate appeared to be on the Taira's side during the Battle of Mizushima, when a solar eclipse aided the Taira in victory. Although lucky, there is still a lot that goes into a victory of that caliber. And although, yes, in the end, things went bad, and yes, things could have gone better, and yes, things could have certainly gone more his way, returning once again to the Battle of Dan-no-ura can perhaps be the purest display of bad luck coming face to face with Munemori and his family, as not only did the wind switch directions, causing the Taira to lose their initial advantage at sea, but also the defection of Taguchi Shigeyoshi, a samurai commander under his leadership who he had been warned about prior to the battle, did end up betraying the Taira, helping pave the way to their defeat and the death of Emperor Antoku. Luck was often never on Munemori's side, but then again, nothing often really ever was. This is why I feel a 2 out of 5 would be a good rating for his overall luck. So once again now, as we can see, this is how our ratings pan out for Munemori as a prominent figure in the Genpei War. Yet we have one more figure to go in this video before we compare them all together. Next up is Emperor Go-Shirakawa.
Go-Shirakawa first really took the historical stage during the lead-up to the Hogen disturbance when his half-brother, Emperor Konoe, passed away of disease. Go-Shirakawa succeeded Konoe as emperor, but not because anyone really wanted him filling the position. Rather, he was coronated as a placeholder for his son, who was strongly supported by many of the top people in the imperial court, but could not actually sit on the throne until Go-Shirakawa had been there first. Go-Shirakawa was even described by his own father, the supremely powerful retired Emperor Toba, as quote-unquote not up for the task of being emperor. This reputation partly coming from his deep infatuation as a young man with a style of popular folk songs called imayo. I have heard a Japanese YouTuber put Go-Shirakawa's situation into modern terms by describing it as being like if a royal family member today were spending all their free time making rap songs. Anyway, despite Go-Shirakawa taking the throne as a placeholder, and despite the people around him not taking him particularly seriously, he would end up seizing control of the imperial court and becoming the most influential person there for the next nearly 4 decades. Those 4 decades would see a great deal of ebb and flow in his power as he struggled with the Taira, the Minamoto, and even his own son for control of the government. But he never stayed down for long, and he consistently displayed a strong desire to be in charge of the country. Even Minamoto no Yoritomo had to wait till Go-Shirakawa died to obtain the title of Seitai Shogun, because as long as the ex-emperor was alive, he refused to fully release his grip on power. Go-Shirakawa wanted to be the #1 guy in Japan, and while his father may have been right about him not being up to the task in some areas, he made up for his deficiencies with his ambition to rule. Ambition strong enough to warrant him a full 5 out of 5.
Go-Shirakawa is someone who often used and disposed of samurai time and time again in pursuit of his own aims, which is ironic, being that in the end his own power would come to be eclipsed by samurai themselves. This leads to the argument that had he been a greater figure, much strife in Japan may have been avoided. Much of this may stem from the fact that Go-Shirakawa was never in a solid position when he was at the top of the country, and thus the relationships he had always waned. Be it with Taira no Kiyomori, who had come to hold all the power in the imperial capital, or later, after the end of the Genpei War, when Minamoto no Yoritomo, who too held more power, and thus would come to essentially dominate the country under the first shogunate. Go-Shirakawa was always just in the lesser position, not having the strength or influence to challenge the more powerful figures of his day and age. And even when he did try, his efforts were often in vain. But on top of all that, his own personality has even been called into question. There are accusations of him being heavily wishy-washy in terms of both his political and life desires, said to have been one to follow the trends of the time and not often appear as a true individual, while also being one to simply carry out his will without often thinking things through and with disregard to whatever obstacles were in his way. That is not to say that he was completely useless. He did get his way at times, and there is certainly something to be said about many still wishing to earn his approval as the emperor. But in the end, I find it fitting to give him a 2 out of 5 in terms of his actual political ability.
Despite technically being the leader of Japan's imperial court throughout much of the second half of the 12th century, as one studies this period, Go-Shirakawa never really comes off as a leader in the modern sense of the word. He was simply there, throwing his weight around more as an exalted socialite than as a politician, although this is probably as much a commentary on the role of the imperial patriarch in late Heian society as it is on Go-Shirakawa himself. Still, Go-Shirakawa's political goals seem to mostly revolve around promoting and protecting favorites and taking down personal enemies, and when push came to shove, his #1 priority was always protecting himself. We rarely see him attempting to rally people behind his own projects, instead often seeming to be along for the ride, such as in the case of the Shishigatani conspiracy in 1177, in which a number of his courtiers conspired to take down the rising Taira clan, and Go-Shirakawa casually sat in on one of their meetings. When the Genpei War broke out in 1180, Go-Shirakawa was happy to take on the role of supporting cast member rather than main character, issuing imperial orders for the subjugation of both Taira and Minamoto leaders on various occasions, depending on who seemed to be more likely to lose at any given moment. He was an infamous fair-weather friend, having periods of both friendship and hostility with almost every major samurai leader of the war, a fickleness which might have benefited him personally, but certainly didn't stir the hearts of his subordinates. Again, one could argue that this was the only role that his social status allowed him to play, but when one looks at other examples of similar historical figures like the later Emperor Go-Daigo and Prince Moriyoshi of the Nambokcho era, or even Go-Shirakawa's own son, Prince Mochihito, whose actions kicked off the Genpei War, it is clear that his imperial blood was not an automatic disqualifier from taking a firmer stance in a time of crisis. For his apparent lack of any clear vision or agenda throughout the chaos of the late 12th century, and his tendency to either give into or run away from his foes, I feel that I have little choice but to give Go-Shirakawa a paltry 1 out of 5 for his leadership score.
Go-Shirakawa was not a popular figure, despite the fact that he was the emperor, which may have been the only reason why he was ever given any time or attention. In years past, he has been described as manipulative and deceitful, and neither Kiyomori nor Yoritomo in the end had much respect for him either, as Go-Shirakawa appeared as a thorn in their sides, rather than that of the significant head of state he was meant to be. Thus, so often we hear of those with a great lack of respect for him and what he desired. Rumors say that Yoritomo may have even come to dub him the hilarious nickname of the biggest Tengu of Japan. Tengu being a Japanese folklore spirit, which others have interpreted this quote to be one where Yoritomo is basically calling Go-Shirakawa a goblin, while another popular court noble famously wrote that Go-Shirakawa was the most stupid emperor among Chinese and Japanese emperors. What likely didn't help matters, of course, was the way in which Go-Shirakawa conducted himself, being a massive and even excessive patron of art and religion, which then bled over into such things as constantly singing imayo songs to the pain of those around him. Apparently, even members of his own family were so done with Go-Shirakawa that they would say he had no talent. I could go on, but I think it's quite obvious that Go-Shirakawa was just all around a heavily disliked figure, and because of that, he gets a 1 out of 5 in terms of popularity.
In my long-form video on my channel covering the events of the Genpei War, I made the observation that retired Emperor Go-Shirakawa's death symbolically marked the death of the Heian period itself. Go-Shirakawa was an embodiment of Japan's old order, and as you can probably surmise from that statement, he was hardly at the vanguard of social and political change. The only examples I can immediately call to mind of Go-Shirakawa showing positive powers of foresight are his preemptive strike on his older brother Stoku during the Hogen disturbance of 1156, and his early support of a young Taira no Kiyomori, whose political and military talents Go-Shirakawa was quick to recognize. However, from this point on, history unfolded in a succession of events which played out contrary to the retired monarch's expectations. The Taira clan's eventual usurpation of the reins of government, the tyranny of Minamoto no Yoshinaka after driving the Taira out of Kyoto, the unwillingness of Minamoto no Yoritomo to become an obedient servant of the imperial court, the list goes on. Go-Shirakawa was at least not so short-sighted as to ever completely lose his relevance in Japan's political world. I cannot deny that he had a decent sense of whom he needed to side with at any given moment to save his own skin, but so much of his life consisted of him being caught off guard by new developments or having his schemes thwarted by some unexpected foe that I can only give him a foresight score of 2 out of 5.
Surprisingly enough, despite all of Go-Shirakawa's shortcomings, we can't say that he was all around an unlucky figure. Sure, the odds were often stacked against him, and as we have already discussed, there was plenty that did not go his way. He was never able to properly challenge the Taira directly, and later had no way to stop the rise of the Minamoto, and his own poor behavior had earned him some undesirable reputation as it is. Yet some of that is hard to truly label as luck, when they become his own personal characteristics. If anything, the largest source of bad luck was that he was made to coexist at the same time as someone as powerful as Taira no Kiyomori, a figure who would upend the nation's stability and lead Japan into the Genpei War, only then to later be replaced with an equally as powerful figure in that of Minamoto no Yoritomo, who would truly take most of the power of running the government away. But even then, he lived on without much interference, in lavish luxury, free to enjoy his passions, dying peacefully in 1192, still in a place of arguable power. For this, I feel it is only natural for him to receive a mid-grade of 3 out of 5 in terms of his luck. So as you can see, this is how Emperor Go-Shirakawa shakes out. Now that we have evaluated him, the 3 figures we have set out to cover in this video are complete. So, with that said, let's compare all of them side by side. The reason why these 3 figures are so important to examine together is that they all fit into the same theater throughout the build-up to and during the actual course of the Genpei War, being heavily involved within Kyoto and affecting imperial politics. Right away, as you can see, Kiyomori stacks up to be the greatest of these figures, scoring the highest in both his political ability and leadership, while also having ambition to rival that of Go-Shirakawa. His son Munemori, however, was a massive downgrade, scoring far lower in every single category. And while, just like I mentioned, Go-Shirakawa had loads of ambition, he scored rather poorly in every other category as well. It just goes to really illustrate that Taira no Kiyomori was able to have such a massive impact because he had the expertise in political ability and leadership that Munemori and Go-Shirakawa did not. However, the areas in which each of these figures share roughly the same results is in that of their popularity, foresight, and luck, with none of them scoring higher than a 3 in those fields. If one of them could have had higher ability in any of those categories, things may have gone very different throughout the course of history. But this is also where things get interesting, because it is where we can begin to theorize just a bit on how things would have been different if each figure had what they each lacked. Had Kiyomori, for example, had better foresight and luck, he may have been able to put his grand plans into action in a more stable way that did not lead the country into a major war that meant the doom of his family. Which then of course moves on to Munemori, who really, if he just had more ability in every category, would have made for a much stronger successor to the Taira clan, in which he may have been more successful at finishing what his father had started. And then of course there is Go-Shirakawa, who if he had greater political skill, leadership, popularity, and foresight, would have truly been the supreme monarch he likely dreamed he was, and would have been far better to contend with figures such as Kiyomori and Minamoto no Yoritomo. But that is all just a fair bit of speculation. This was a really fun video to make, but the discussion is not over yet. Head on over to Buyuuden's channel to see the next part, in which we will continue to examine Minamoto no Yoshinaka, Minamoto no Yoshitsune, and Minamoto no Yoritomo. I'll link the video down below and at the end. And while you're at it, be sure to subscribe to him as well. His videos and attention to detail are phenomenal, not to mention the fact that he's actually in Japan and able to use Japanese sources. Please check him out. Yet, with that all said, thank you for watching this video though, and don't forget to like, subscribe, and ring that notification bell if you enjoyed it and found it to be most interesting.